So today we are shifting from the discussion we had last time about paganism to the beginning of our discussion about earliest Christianity. And at the outset, what I want to say is a little bit about how we approach these particular texts in this class. So obviously, reading the New Testament has a lot of implications and it's very important as a series of texts for a large number of you. Um, what we want to do in this class and with this particular discussion is to approach these texts in a way that is kind of contextualizing them in the larger world around them. And so, what that means and what we ask of you is that as you're reading these texts, you need to appreciate the power and the success of these texts, whether or not you personally believe in the teachings that they present. So whether you believe that Jesus came with a divine mission or you simply think he was a wise man, what we have to understand is the people who heard him teach had an idea of how to understand the importance of this. And the people who read the New Testament also had an idea of how to understand the importance of what these texts are saying. And this didn't just occur. There's something in Jesus' teachings and in these texts that particularly did appeal to them and had a real strong impression on them. And it's important, I think, to also understand that Christianity is a religion that spread and generated a lot of followers because of the power of the texts it created. And that's a historical fact. Now, Christianity succeeded because large numbers of people did find the texts that were written by Christians about Christianity to be very persuasive. So persuasive, in fact, that it changed the way that they lived their lives. And that's a historical phenomenon that is interesting and important to understand, even if you personally do not believe those texts or accept what those texts are saying. And so what we want to do in the next three classes is try to figure out why it is these texts are so successful. And it is historically well documented that these texts work very, very well to do and to achieve what they want to achieve. But to understand earliest Christianity, it's important, I think, to understand the world in which this began. This is a Jewish world. Jesus' teaching had such an impact because, in a sense, Jesus' teaching began in a particular historical moment. And that historical moment was a Jewish historical moment in the first century AD. And to do this, it's important to understand how it is that Jews, the vast majority of the people who heard Jesus preach live, understood the world around them during Jesus' life. And Jesus was, of course, born a Jew. Now, there is a particular conception that's going to be really important to understand when we're thinking about what Jesus looks to do and then how the message and the audience that Jesus was spreading in a Jewish community eventually spreads to a wider world. And the way to get at that is to look particularly at how Jews in particular understood their community and the larger world around them. And so in the Jewish conception in the first century AD, Jews who spoke Greek used two different kinds of words, or two different words, to conceptualize their community versus the community around them. And these two Greek words are genos and ethnos. So genos is a word that sometimes is translated as race in non-Jewish texts. What it basically means is this is a kind of biological community you belong to. It's bigger in a sense than a family. It's instead the kind of people that you belong to. Ethnos is different. Ethnos is often translated as a nation in other texts, but when you see in the New Testament, you see the word Gentile, that's ethnos. And so in a Jewish conception of the world, Jews are, in a sense, a hereditary community, and they are therefore a genos. It's very hard to enter that community, and the conversion process that we know about from early first century through like third century Judaism, it involved a process of the person who was not a member of the Jewish genos basically ceremonially swearing or forswearing the genealogical and hereditary background, the non-Jewish genealogical and hereditary background they possessed, and taking on membership in this new biological community. And on some level that's a fiction, but it is something that has to be ceremonially celebrated because it's seen as a major step in which the person converting to Judaism gives up, in a sense, membership in a different genos to take on membership in the Jewish genos. Versus an ethnos, this is a sort of catch-all phrase, right? The Gentiles that you see in the New Testament are the ethnoi, a word that means basically all of the other nations of the world that are not Jewish and are not bound in this same kind of intense hereditary or pseudo-hereditary way. Probably the best way to understand this is to actually look at this stone. And this is particularly important for us because it's likely that Jesus actually saw this very stone. This is a temple, this is an inscription that was placed at the Jerusalem temple, the temple that we see talked about. And it prohibits access to non-Jews. Now, the inscription itself is pretty interesting. This was right above the entryway to the temple, and anyone walking into it would see the sign that says, "No one of a different heritage." And the word here is allogene, meaning a different genos, or a non-Jew, is permitted to enter the sacred space around the temple or the temple enclosure. And anyone who's caught doing this, who is a member of one of these other gene, will be responsible for ensuing his own death. And so Jews are part of this genos. Anyone who's not part of that genos is very strongly placed outside of the Jewish community, to the point where they are not even allowed into the space where Jews congregate and worship their gods. Now, what this suggests quite strongly is that in the period that we're talking about, Jewish life is very strongly centered upon that Jewish temple. And it's very strongly centered upon the region in which that temple is located. And so in the first century, so this is what the temple looked like. And in the first century, Jews in Palestine had the very disorienting experience of moving from an independent kingdom to being put under Roman control. So when the temple was built, it was built by King Herod the Great. And King Herod the Great ruled until the very beginning of the first century AD. But then when he died, the independent kingdom was eventually absorbed by Rome. And when Jesus was born, it was right at the end of Herod's reign. Now, this absorption by Rome is significant because the Jewish kingdom that was absorbed by Rome was one of the very few states in the Middle East that overthrew one of the successors of Alexander the Great and created its own independent kingdom. And so the Jewish kingdom was something that was very strongly valued by the Jews in Palestine. And so by the time Jesus comes into maturity, about a generation has passed since that kingdom lost its independence. And the world of Palestine at that moment is kind of gripped by a process of figuring out what it means to be Jewish, having lost your independence and now having come under Roman rule. And so we see kind of references in our sources to four different groups of people trying to figure this out. Now, these are catch-all categories. These are, in a sense, similar to the concept of paganism we talked about last time. These are categories that, in a sense, moderns and outsiders have imposed on very diverse groups of people. But these categories themselves help us understand what the reality of life in Judea at that moment was like. So one group is the Pharisees, and this is a group of scribes that are concerned with how to adapt the teachings of Judaism to a changed reality in which the world is becoming more complicated, and the Old Testament prohibitions don't seem to work as well in the first century world as they did when they were written down originally. And so these people are, in a sense, kind of Jewish reformers, but they're Jewish reformers who are trying to figure out how the traditions of Judaism can be made to fit in a different context. A different group is the Sadducees. The Sadducees are a kind of Jewish aristocracy, and they got along very well with the Romans, in part because the Roman way of imposing control on these territories that came under Roman authority was to reach out to the aristocracy in those communities and try to reach some sort of an agreement that allowed the aristocracy to protect most of its privileges in exchange for their cooperation with Roman authorities. And so the Sadducees are mainly this group. Again, they might not have all called themselves Sadducees. This is a word that outsiders more or less use for a bigger group. But the way to understand these people are they are Jewish community leaders, sort of a hereditary aristocracy, who are being induced to cooperate with the Romans and are interested in doing this. A group that's probably in some ways the opposite of this is the Essenes. So the Essenes are Jews whose response to this new political order is to say that society is completely corrupt. Judaism really just cannot be something that one practices in this corrupt society. And so they withdraw into the desert. And they withdraw into religious communities that are separate from the world. They have therefore no political interest in the Romans. What they want to do is instead separate completely from a corrupt political reality and focus on their religious practices. And so these may more or less be the same kinds of people as are responsible for writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fourth group is in some ways the most interesting. These are politically motivated Jews who want to overthrow Roman rule. And these aren't people that are particularly religious. Some of them are religious, but they're not sort of radically religious like the Essenes. Instead, they're mainly political actors who feel that the Maccabean rebellion that overthrew Hellenistic Greek rule is a great inspiration, and they can use some of that same energy to also overthrow Roman rule. Now, this is how Judaism is working in Judea. But a larger part of the Jewish community actually lived outside of Judea. They lived in communities across the Mediterranean, in communities like Alexandria or Rome or Lyon. And this gives you a sense of the kind of way that these Jews interacted with the world around them. So this is the Jewish synagogue. These are wall decorations from the Jewish synagogue at Dura Europos in Syria. And the synagogue at Dura was acting with a community of people that didn't speak Hebrew. And so the Jewish interactions at the community that the community at Dura had was conducted in Greek. And so you can see here in this image, on the upper right, you see the letters AR, O-N in transliteration, or Alpha, Rho, Omega, Nu. That's Aaron. That's the Old Testament figure Aaron. But his name is written in Greek and identified in Greek because the community that interacted with and the community that used this synagogue did not speak Hebrew. They were Jews who spoke primarily Greek. And so their Torah was translated into Greek. Their synagogue services were done in Greek. And they adopted some of the cultural attitudes of the people surrounding them, which is why you see images of people in these representations. And it's into this world that Jesus was born and began teaching. Now, Jesus may have been born as early as 4 BC or as late as 6 AD. The census dates and the political details of Herod's reign that are referenced in the various books of the New Testament don't really work well together. And so we have a decade range. And basically, when early people who were putting together the chronology of Christianity tried to figure this out, they realized that there was this discrepancy. And so what they did is they picked the year 1. There is no year 0. And so the middle between 4 BC and 6 AD is 1 AD, and therefore that's what we have. That's probably as good as we can do, and it's probably as good as we would hope to do. Jesus' ministry begins around the year 30. And his ministry begins like that of a Jewish holy man. And so he preaches in synagogues. He argues with Pharisees about their new interpretations of Judaism. And in the earliest Gospels, what we see is that Jesus' interest and his appeal is primarily directed to non-Jews. And so the Gospels make it pretty clear when they're assembling stories about Jesus' life that these stories usually center on Jesus' interactions with Jews. So a good example of this is this passage, Matthew 15:21. And this is a passage that describes Jesus in one of the very few times he leaves Judea. He goes into the province of Phoenicia. And we're told that Jesus left Judea, he went then to Phoenicia, and he went to Tyre and Sidon, two of the famous Phoenician cities. And just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But Jesus didn't answer her at all. And so his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." And he answers, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So this is the story that's told. And what we see in this story, and this is an early tradition about Jesus, what we see in this story is Jesus does not feel that it is his duty to do anything or interact at all with people who are not part of the Jewish genos. He's sent only to work with the lost sheep of the house of Israel, meaning members of the Jewish genos. Now, eventually, as the story we have it now tells us, he did heal this woman's daughter, but that may actually be in a later addition to the story, or it may reflect a transition in how Jesus is seeing things. But generally speaking, across the Gospels, what we see is Jesus interacts overwhelmingly, almost exclusively with Jews. His miracles are performed on Jews, and they're done in a way that's supposed to be appealing to Jews. And so in his lifetime, Jesus was a Jewish leader, and his identity during his life was tied to this fact. So in the times that he lived, Jewish identity is something that is quite important. But it's also something that has political implications, because Jesus is living at a moment when the political concerns of the zealous are becoming very, very important. And because Jesus is a public figure speaking about Judaism and teaching about Judaism, people really began to wonder about where he stood on the political questions of the day. And so we can see this when the Gospel of Luke talks about the trial that Jesus, that's conducted by Pontius Pilate. So the assembly rises as a body and brings Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor. And they begin to accuse him, saying, "We found this man to be perverting our nation." Now the word here used is ethnos, forbidding to pay taxes to the emperor and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. And Pilate then asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "You say so." Now, nation or ethnos here, this is important because these are representatives of the Jewish community speaking to the Roman governor. The Roman governor doesn't acknowledge that Jews are a genos. He doesn't acknowledge this kind of exclusive way of Jews talking about themselves. And so they're using here the language that Romans understand. Romans understand their empire to be made up of a whole bunch of discrete ethnoi. But these ethnoi, or nations, are all in a sense equal. And so when Jews are speaking to Romans, and when they're making this official accusation before the Roman governor, they're speaking in the language that Romans understand. This idea of the Jews as one of the many nations under Roman control, not an exclusive genos that is special and distinct. And so what Pilate is asking is a political question. Politically, the Roman Empire is an entity that brings together all of these different nations. And what Pilate is saying is, do you represent yourself to be the king of the Jewish nation? And Jesus answers, well, you say so. Jesus doesn't say, I am the king of the Jewish nation. He says, well, this is what you're saying. But the king of the Jewish nation, when Pilate asks this, is a political question. If Jesus is the king of the Jewish nation, what he's saying is the Jewish nation needs to be separate from the Roman Empire. It is no longer one of the many ethnoi that belongs to the Roman Empire. It's instead something that's completely, that is an ethnos that has separated itself off. And that's an act of sedition. And so what Pilate is doing here is asking a political question, because his concern here is political. And the people who bring Jesus before Pilate are bringing him forward on a political, on political grounds of usurpation, and sedition against Roman imperial authority. And so this is what Pilate is particularly concerned about, because his job as a Roman administrator is simply to just keep things under control. Now, crucifixion is the political penalty for the sorts of things that Jesus is supposed to have done. Crucifixion is an action that's taken against people leading sedition against the Roman state. And it's a particularly brutal way to die. Crucifixion was absolutely horrible. When we think of crucifixion, what we think is, you get nailed to the cross, you bleed out, you eventually, die pretty quickly from loss of blood. That is not how crucifixion actually works. Crucifixion is something where you get nailed to the cross and you hang there. And it can take as long as 10 days for someone to die of crucifixion. And they hang there, insects attack them, birds attack them, they're pecked at, it's painful, it's brutal, and eventually they die not from loss of blood, but they die because they can no longer breathe. They become so exhausted that their diaphragm doesn't work anymore. It's death by torture. And what you see is this is also a death that has a tremendous amount of stigma attached to it. Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified because this is seen as something that is below the status that Roman citizens, it's below the status of a Roman citizen to be killed this way. Only the worst non-Roman criminals are killed this way. And so when the New Testament describes Jesus dying of crucifixion very quickly, this quick death is seen as a miracle. It's an act of a merciful God. And because of what crucifixion meant, the memory of the horror of this experience is something that Christians don't directly represent for a very long time. And so this is an image of Christ from the year 400 AD. This is how Christ is depicted for a very, very long time. The first time we actually see Christ suffering is not until 1300 AD, when the memory of crucifixion has long since passed from people's memory. Now, and here's another representation of Jesus from the 4th century. Again, carrying the cross, but not on the cross. Now, after Jesus' death, there's a real question about what Christianity should become. Because Jesus' ministry was primarily directed towards Jews. But the followers of Jesus begin advocating after his death that the example of Jesus is something that's relevant to everybody. It's not just relevant to members of the Jewish genos, it's relevant to all of the ethnoi across the Roman Empire and across the world. And so we see, for example, that in the book of Acts, there's a real question about whether one can do this. The Apostle Paul, who is a crucial figure in the extension of Christian mission to the genoi, to the ethnoi, to the Gentiles, Paul argues that the message of Jesus transcends Judaism, and it was something that he felt could be expanded to include non-Jews. But there's significant pushback to this. So in the book of Acts, what we hear is that certain individuals came from Judea, and they began telling people that you couldn't actually become Christian unless you were circumcised. So basically, they were saying that you had to become Jewish first before you could become Christian. Paul tells us in Galatians what his action or his response to this is. So after 14 years of teaching, I went to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus with me. And I laid before the people who were saying these sorts of things. I laid the gospel before them that I proclaim among the Gentiles, the ethnoi, in order to make sure that I was not running astray. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. So therefore, Titus is not a member of the Jewish genos, but he is a Christian. And Paul was saying that, Titus is a member of the ethnoi, but he is a Christian. And this has to be acceptable. And it's then agreed in a council in the city of Jerusalem, it's agreed that you don't need to be Jew. You don't need to follow Jewish law. You don't need to be circumcised. You don't need to be a member of the Jewish genos to be a Christian. So the Apostle Peter at the end of this council says this: I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles, those ethnoi, who are turning to God, but we should write to them only that they need to abstain from things polluted by idols of gods and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled and from blood. And so Acts and Galatians agree. Christians had decided to allow anyone who accepted Christ into the community of Christians. And so what this means is, following this moment, the community of Christians is not confined to the Jewish genos. It instead can involve anybody who belongs to any of the ethnoi around the world. And for Paul, this is a key step, because what he saw in Christianity was a maturation of divine thought. And so salvation, Paul claimed, wasn't something that came out of the Old Testament. It was instead something that was guaranteed by faith in Jesus. And so that meant that the rules of the Old Testament shouldn't have to apply, because they are in a sense now superseded by what Jesus teaches. So Paul says in Galatians, we know that a person does not behave justly simply by the works of Jewish law. He instead behaves justly through faith in Jesus. And we've come to believe in Jesus Christ so that we might behave justly through Jesus, and not just simply by following the letter of the Jewish law, because no one will be justified simply through the works of the Jewish law. And so practically speaking, what this means is, according to Paul, the teaching of Jesus supersedes the laws and regulations that govern Jewish life in the Old Testament. Jesus, in a sense, is a new covenant that supersedes the old covenant of the Old Testament. And to highlight the distinction of the new order that Jesus has brought, Paul frames a sort of difference between Jews and Christians and pagans and Christians by using the metaphor of children and adults. Jews and pagans, he says, are like children, and the law was put in place to show them how to behave. And so while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And so now you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God. Now this is a key passage that lays out one of the most important teachings in the Pauline ideas of Christianity. It says in essence that before Jesus, pagans and Jews are essentially in the same position. They're basically slaves, bound to rough traditions and dictates that tell them how to behave, but they don't really have any kind of knowledge or share in the gifts of God. And so their traditions had served them in a way. Jews had been led to a kind of shadowy righteousness by the regulation of their behavior through Jewish law, circumcision, and other restrictions on what they did. And pagans are less righteous because they had less specific laws. But they too are bound by behaviors from a supernatural order, and therefore they also are slaves. It's just the slavery is less precise, and the sorts of things it brought about were even worse than what Jewish law brought about. But with the coming of Jesus, both pagans and Jews are now given the opportunity to fully and completely become children of God. And this meant that pagans no longer needed the old gods and old rituals and old teachings of paganism, because now a new covenant supersedes them. But it also meant that Jews no longer needed the old laws and old practices of the Old Testament that had restrained their conduct. They too, like pagans, could embrace this new sort of freedom that is guaranteed by the new covenant of Jesus. A new sort of freedom that comes through faith in Jesus and is guaranteed by the life of Jesus. So this is a really compelling and powerful rhetoric, but it also pointed towards a type of Christianity that was truly revolutionary, because this was a type of Christianity that equally promised salvation to both Jews and non-Jews. It's different in a sense from what Jesus did during his life. But it also marked a really significant change in how Christianity could develop. Because Christianity, up to the point where Paul begins experimenting and spreading this gospel in this particular way to non-Jews, had been a sect among Judaism. And what that meant is its potential for growth is very, very low. Because as a sect within Judaism, the religious marketplace in which it operated was very small. In essence, you had to become a Jew before you could become a Christian. And Jews were a very small part of the Roman world and a much smaller part of the entire world writ large. But after the Council of Jerusalem endorsed the way that Paul was preaching to non-Christians, to non-Jews, the marketplace that Christianity could reach was much bigger. It was now the entire world. Because you didn't need to be a Jew to become a Christian. You could be anything. You could be a pagan, you could be a Jew, you could be anything, and you could convert to Christianity. And this is important for another reason too. The way that one appeals to people in the pagan religious marketplace is different from the way one has to appeal to Jews if you are part of a sect of Judaism. Because if you're a mainstream Jew who embraces Christianity, you are part of a monotheistic religion. You have to give up what you were doing before and take on new activities. You are, in a sense, converting from being a Jew to being a Christian. And that is a very hard sell, especially given the way that Judaism conceives of itself as this genos, as this kind of almost ethnicity. You would have to turn your back on your sort of larger clan and larger community that you belong to become a Christian. But paganism doesn't work that way. Unlike Judaism, paganism has no objection to people adding new gods and adding new divine beings to the roster of divine beings they worship. And so Roman pagans who hear about Jesus could embrace the idea that Jesus is a god without saying that the other gods they worship are no longer gods. And many, many, many Roman pagans actually do accept the idea that Jesus is a god that you can think about, that you can pray to, and you can benefit from. And many pagans who don't ever become Christians accept that Jesus is a god without accepting the restrictions that Christianity will subsequently place on their other religious conducts. Because pagans can do this. And there are some very famous pagans who do this. The Empress Julia Domna in the 3rd century had a statue of Christ in her household alongside statues of other gods and holy men, actually in the imperial palace. And she prayed to Jesus just like she prayed to Apollonius of Tyana and just like she prayed to Venus. Jesus was just one of the many gods she identified with. Of course, Christians would say you can't do this, but pagans don't see a problem in doing this. Even the pagan Emperor Julian, who converts from Christianity to paganism in the 350s, he also agrees that Christ is a god. He just doesn't believe that Christ is the only God, or that some of the teachings that Christ was presenting are teachings that he wants to follow. And so the task of converting pagans to Christianity works on sort of 2 levels. The first is convincing pagans that Jesus is a god. And Christians are very successful in doing this. But not all pagans who believe that Jesus is a god ultimately become Christians. Because the second phase for Christians is to then convince these pagans who believe that Jesus is a god that Jesus' teachings dictate that they can't then worship any other gods. But initially, what's important to understand is Christians are competing in the same religious marketplace as a huge number of pagan cults, including pagan cults like that created by, for example, Alexander Rabanatekos. And so Paul's letter to the Galatians shows Christianity working in this larger world. Not Christianity as a form of Judaism, but something that's distinct in its own right. And what becomes clear from the letter to the Galatians and other Christian texts like the book of Acts is that Christians enjoyed certain very clear advantages when they began working to convert people in this environment. First of all, what we see is no other group is doing what they're doing. There are no pagan missionaries. Instead, what pagans do is they are working in this religious marketplace and they're trying to kind of build buzz about new cults or keep people excited about existing cults. But they're not going around trying to convert people to paganism. There's also not much Jewish mission activity trying to convince pagans to adopt the new religion. And so the idea of attracting converts is completely foreign to most of the other cults in this particular religious marketplace. No one is going around trying to actively shift people's religious identity to an exclusive brand of religious activity. Only Christians are doing this. And second, Christian communities are much more unified than any other religious group. They have a hierarchy, they have a set of ideas. As the first century concludes, they begin to have a series of texts. And so what this means is they're very well positioned to appeal to immigrants and minority communities that have moved from their homelands into the major cities of the Roman world. And we don't actually think of a Roman world in which there's lots of immigration, in a sense, because a lot of the people immigrating are just people immigrating within the empire. But we have to understand, again, to go back to this map, there are major cities in the Roman Empire. The city of Rome itself has 1 million people. The city of Alexandria has perhaps 300 to 500,000 people. The city of Carthage has maybe 200 to 300,000 people. The city of Antioch in Syria has, again, 200 to 300,000 people. These are very, very large cities. And the Roman world is, maybe outside of China, the most urbanized area in the entire world at this point in time. And the massive cities you have in the urban world are cities that don't naturally sustain their population. And so those 1 million people in Rome have perhaps a death rate that is about 3% more people dying in those cities than are born and live past age 5. And so what this means is all of these massive cities are kind of literary death traps that maintain a steady population only because people move to these cities from the countryside. And the people moving to these cities from the countryside live in really dense urban environments. And they also live in these sort of intensely organized communities in like apartment buildings and other things where you interact closely with a lot of people around them. And so what this means is a lot of ideas can spread quickly in these communities of people who have settled in a city and are looking to establish themselves in a new environment without the traditional ties and peer groups that they're used to in their homelands. And so this is the first group of Gentiles to whom Christians minister. Immigrants and members of these large urban communities. Christianity is, in its first couple centuries, an urban religion that spreads by word of mouth in these communities of people who have moved into major cities across the Roman world. And overwhelmingly, it's Greek-speaking immigrants moving into these cities who convert to Christianity first. Now, these are important trends. But the mission to the Gentiles got a later start than the mission among the Jews, and up until 70 AD, the Gentile community of Christians was smaller than the number of Jewish converts. But this changes following a series of traumatic events in the 60s AD. We talked at the outset of this lecture about the political turmoil in Judea at this time. Now, the Zealots become more and more influential and get more and more followers as time passes. And in 66 AD, Zealots who are looking to expel Roman power from Judea launch a revolt against Roman rule. Now, they do this, and it's a very scary revolt for people living in the area. We have accounts of refugees fleeing to cities like Beit She'an in what's now northern Israel. But they are eventually crushed overwhelmingly by military forces led by the future Emperor Vespasian and then the future Emperor Titus. And so we talked a couple weeks ago about the Arch of Titus, put up by Domitian to honor his brother. This is a representation of the Arch of Titus that shows Titus's capture of Jerusalem and his taking of the plunder from the temple. And you see, of course, the menorah taken from the temple. The temple is destroyed during the Jewish revolt. And the last holdouts against the Roman forces die when the fortress of Masada is stormed by Roman troops in 73. Now, though we probably don't initially expect this, the Jewish revolt has a kind of incredibly destructive effect on the Jewish Christian population in Judea, and also, because of this, on the trajectory of Christianity across the empire. The Jewish population across all of Judea is devastated by the Jewish revolt. Lots and lots of people die, lots of people are enslaved, lots of community structures are destroyed, and the Jewish Christian population, these Jews who converted to Christianity, they also bear tremendous amounts of casualties in this battle. And a small Jewish type Christian community did survive, but the destruction of this community, of much of this community in Judea, means that moving forward, Christianity after the Jewish revolt is a Gentile movement. It's a movement that conducts its activities in Greek rather than the Aramaic that the Jewish Christians and Jesus himself would have spoken. And the Gospels, therefore, are written in Greek because they are appealing to this wider audience. And whereas the first Christians saw themselves as part of a sect of Judaism competing with other Jewish sects, the destruction of much of that community means that Christians of the first century are citizens of the world. They are working to bring Christianity to all of the ethnoi across this Roman Empire. And this is something that had already begun in the 40s. So we hear for the first time the word Christianoi is used to describe a group of followers of Jesus in Antioch, the most important city in Syria, who speak Greek. By the end of the first century, we have large communities existing in Rome, Alexandria, and other major cities across the empire. And this growth was in large part created by the urban environment, the interconnectivity of the major cities of the Roman world, and the living environment in which people across the Roman world lived in these large apartment buildings and built strong connections to each other. But these things are only facilitating factors. They don't really explain what the success of Christianity was due to. And so when we discuss Christianity's growth, what we have to remember is we are discussing a movement that grows by getting actual people to change their ideas and ultimately change their behavior. It's something that happens one person at a time. And because of that, the decisions to embrace this new religion involve persuasion. So even if you're in a diverse religious marketplace where you can sample many different cults, you have to be convinced that a new religion is worth your time and is worth the commitment that it's asking you to make. And there are a number of ways in which this convincing can occur. But one of the most popular and common explanations for Christianity's growth is the power of Christians to expose their friends and family to these new ideas and this new God, Jesus. And there are many examples of this in our sources. Clearly, this interpersonal relationship played a huge role in getting more people to give Christianity a try. And we saw that this isn't exclusively true of Christianity. The cult that Alexander Rabanitenko sets up also spreads by word of mouth. But what we see is that Christianity succeeds far better than any other religion in the ancient world. And Paul's letter to the Galatians, which you looked at for today, shows a little bit of how this is done. Because in that letter, Paul talks about how he came to visit the churches in Galatia. And it was actually something of an accidental visit. Galatia is an area Paul was traveling across, but he got sick while he was traveling, and so he had to stop and recuperate. But while he was in Galatia, he spoke to the people who hosted him. These are Christians or interested parties who like to host Christian teachers, and he convinced them and some of the people around them about the promise of salvation that Christianity offered, and then he went on his way. Now, Paul says that he was able to do this because God appointed him to do this. So Paul says, I am Paul, an apostle, sent neither by human commission nor from human authorities, but I was sent through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the members of God's family who are with me. And so Paul describes himself as a figure charged by God, not human authorities, but God, to spread the word of Jesus' teaching to everyone who is there to listen to it. And Paul is an incredibly powerful teacher and incredibly charismatic. And people are obviously very taken with the ideas he introduced. But it's also clear that the people he inspired listened to him, absorbed his teaching, and then found a community or formed a community that was bound together by ties of fellowship that then would sustain this community after Paul left. Because Paul is not like a bishop in the 4th century Christian church. He doesn't stay in one place and manage the Christianity in a community. What he does is he introduces the idea to a community, builds a kind of community of fellowship through the charisma that bring people into that room. They learn about Christianity through him, but they sustain the community themselves. And what's interesting is that the letter to the Galatians shows that Paul is not the only person doing this. He's not the only Christian teacher traveling around with these ideas. There are actually many different Christian teachers, and each have kind of their own take on what Christianity was. And at this point, there's not yet an institutionalized church that can say to the Galatians, this is correct Christian teaching, and this is incorrect Christian teaching. There's no kind of arbiter or bishop or pope who can decide who was right and who was wrong. And so once Paul moves on to other cities, other Christian teachers come through Galatia. The community with the Galatians, or of the Galatians, is interacting with other Christians by letters. And when other Christians come through the area, they stop, they visit this community, and they teach what they know. And some of these other Christian teachers who come to Galatia teach the Galatians something different from what Paul did. And the letter to the Galatians is Paul's response to this. So Paul starts by saying, I was sent by God to come to your community, and I came to your community and I introduced these ideas to you, but I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is a different gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So this is a short and tremendously powerful passage that actually lays out the entire purpose of the letter to the Galatians. Paul is here trying to do a couple of things at once. Paul is saying that I am the one who was called by Christ's grace to come to you and present Christianity to you. But now someone else has come. And what they're doing is they're teaching you something different. They're teaching you a different gospel. But there isn't a different gospel. There's only a gospel that comes from Christ, and those people who teach a different gospel that perverts the gospel of Christ. And because I, Paul, am charged by Christ to present the gospel to you, I am claiming the exclusive authority to present truth to you. And if someone is saying different from what I tell you, they're wrong. They're giving you something that perverts the truth. It undermines the promise of salvation that Christ is making. And so this gets to the second goal of the letter. Paul is claiming a divine authority. And that divine authority is what underlines the claim that Paul's Christianity is right and anything else being presented is wrong. And so what Paul is trying to do here is something with which we're already very familiar. He's trying to use a set of stories to define his authority. And this is something that's done in the first chapter to the letter of the Galatians, in which Paul claims how it is, or Paul describes how it is that he was called by Christ. And so Paul talks about his earlier career persecuting Christians, the divine vision he had on his way to Damascus, and then his shift from a persecutor of Christians to a teacher of Christianity. This story, this kind of origin story, this brief biography of himself, is Paul's proof of divine inspiration. And so in essence, what he's telling the audience is the only thing that could explain such a dramatic change in his orientation towards Christianity is the direct intervention of God. And this proves, Paul asserts, that the divine inspiration that he's claiming animates his teaching. It's real. And unlike the inspiration or the charge that other teachers claim they have, his is genuine, and this genuine inspiration leads Galatians towards truth. These other people who claim to have authority to teach something different, they are leading Galatian Christians astray because they don't have this divine inspiration. They have not been charged by Christ to do these things. And so this points to another good reason why Christianity is able to grow so dramatically in the Roman world. This claim is really powerful. its texts are really, really, really strong in making their cases, and they are incredibly convincing. Now, the letter to Galatians is relatively short, but what we will do next week or next time is look at the book of Matthew, which is one of the most powerful and effective of these texts. And so what we'll do is look at how that text is put together, how it works, and why it would be such a great vehicle for convincing people to think about Jesus as a divine figure.